Hello, and welcome to the Education for Flourishing podcast. I am Maddie Underwood, your co-host with Amrita Chaturvedi and Matthew Lee. Dr. Amrita Chaturvedi is an assistant professor and chair of the Consortium for Human Flourishing at St. Louis University and has taught the course The Art and Science of Human Flourishing at SLU since 2019. Dr. Matt Lee is a professor at Baylor University and the director of the Flourishing Network in the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard. And I, Maddie, am a current pre-service special educator at St. Louis University and the program director for the Education for Flourishing project. Thank you for joining our podcast today, in which we will discuss our own thoughts on flourishing as educators and how we apply it in our lives. In your perspective, what is flourishing?
Well, I think what I have learned from, of course, being part of the Global Flourishing Study, being involved in the work of the Human Flourishing Program and the Flourishing Network, many conversations over the years, is that the word flourishing conjures up different images for different people around the world. So one of the ways that the Human Flourishing Program defines it is that flourishing is a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good, including the context in which that person lives. So a lot of understandings of flourishing don't include the context. It's just basically subjective well-being of the individual. So to me, that's an improvement. And as we've had conversations around the world, some groups have pushed back on whether it's a state or a trait or a journey or an aspiration. And so whether, which of those words we land on help shape how we pursue flourishing. And then the other question is it person-centric? Is human flourishing primarily about the person in their context, or is it about the community, the realm of the sacred, the planet? How do we train the lens on the unit of analysis, whatever that might be? So for many groups, as we've had these conversations, they've said, well, the flourishing of the individual is important, but not as important as communal flourishing. We flourish together. And so any one of us might ebb and flow with regard to a number of domains over time. But the point is to create a community context in which we can pursue flourishing collectively. So my own perspective on this is that it's really helpful to keep things a little bit loose. For me, not to lock it down and say it has to be a trait, or it has to be a state, or it has to be person-centric, or it has to be community-centric. But we have this sense that flourishing is an ideal, that we might flourish in some areas of life more than others, but we may never flourish in all areas equally well. So the Human Flourishing Program's definition requires only that these different aspects are good, not that they're perfect or that they're great. But, if it's perfect or great, then that's more flourishing than good. So I think it's really important for us to remain in dialogue with groups that will point out, for example, that there are different seasons to flourishing. And when we are grieving the loss of a loved one, are we flourishing less than as opposed to before we started grieving? Well, the happiness domain might be reduced, but there's also an opportunity to connect with the depth of life that is increased. So is it, primarily about positive affect and, life satisfaction and some of these kinds of things, or is there some core to flourishing, that we can let these other things vary. And as long as we are connecting with what Paul Wong, an existential psychologist who passed away fairly recently, said is the deep life, not the rich life of hedonistic pleasure or lots of money or, big car, big house, but, connecting with the fullness of life, the deep life. And so, you could argue that someone who is avoiding the fullness of life, even if they seem to have more positive affect or less stress, they may not be fully flourishing. So I hold this all very loosely because I find wisdom and value in the Human Flourishing Program's definition and in some of the other framings that I have been fortunate to be in dialogue with over the years. So, I like to talk about flourishing as an integration, a wholeness amidst adversity, a sense that we are pursuing well-being and well-doing in collaboration with others and in ways that create conditions for all others to flourish without exception. So all others would include people and animals and plants and and then there's the argument about, well, you can have all that stuff, but if you're misaligned spiritually with the sacred narrative that gives your life meaning, then none of that stuff really matters. So ultimately, we are concerned with the sacred, even if that means sacrificing some of the penultimate rather than ultimate domains. So that's a really academic and long-winded answer of, I'm not going to be pinned down so easily, but I find value in all of that. I think that, in my own life, I had tended to focus on a handful of those domains and neglect others, and maybe not fully appreciate the interconnections across levels. So, when you're young, it's more about what can I achieve in my career? And then, when you get older, you say, well, on its own, that kind of individual achievement it's not ultimate, it's penultimate. And I'm getting older. So anyway, that's my opening offering. And so I would say that it's different than subjective well-being. It's not just how Matt feels about his own experience. It's not the plant in the pot, but the set of flowers in the garden. And we don't all bloom 4 seasons out of the year. Sometimes you draw back to the roots in the wintertime. It doesn't mean you're not flourishing. It just means you're not in full blossom. So the word flourishing sometimes trips people up because they think you've got to be in full flight or full blossom. But it's, what's the season and what's appropriate? So the last thing I would say is during COVID, our surveys revealed that in the United States, during the lockdown, some of the domains declined. Happiness and financial material stability and others fell, pretty sharply. And yet social relationships and the pursuit of the good held even. So maybe flourishing during a lockdown means acknowledging that we're not as happy or financially as well off as we once were, and being sad about that. And that's okay to be sad about that, but continue to prioritize relationships and aim towards the good. And that's not the fullness of flourishing, but that's appropriate for that winter season. And I think, there's some level of practical wisdom that is part of the conversation. So I see the dialogues we've been having over the years as enriching the conversation in a way that says, yes, this is a beautiful definition and it's useful for certain purposes, but it's not the fullness of what the word flourishing might mean, or the good life or the deep life or whatever in Spain they talk about fulfillment in plenitude, because flourishing doesn't translate that well. Florer, doesn't quite land the way we would want it to in Spain. And so there's an opportunity for us to say, here's how I'm seeing it. How are you seeing it? And that's why I love these dialogues. So I'll stop with my monologue and invite dialogue.
So, Matt, the first thing I want to say, when you said as you're getting older, I've come to say that we're getting wiser, not older. So that's like the new way for me to look at aging, right? Like it's
I think it's good to prioritize that. My body's getting older. I can't run marathons.
And that's the trade-off. That's the balance, right? Like our bodies may get really slow, or not really slow, a little slow, but our minds get sharper with the wisdom side of things, right? So it's again that balance playing out in life.
Well, I find that helpful, and I know people who are older than I am whose minds are not getting sharper. And so I see that on my horizon as well. And what does it mean to flourish at the end of life? Is it still possible to flourish? The answer is yes, but you flourish differently. It's a different season.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And each stage of our lives, balance is going to look different, and it's going to mean different things, right? So, but for me, coming back to that flourishing side of things, and Matt, you and I have talked about it recently, I would like to think about flourishing as one way to talk about flourishing from a theoretical perspective, right? So in theory, this is what it is. Then there's the philosophical side of flourishing, right? That things should be this way, and this is how it should be, and then there's what I call the practical flourishing, right? The thing that plays out in our daily lives and is something that we can live out, and we can tangibly work with and see and hold and feel, for lack of better words. So I'm going to kind of focus on the practical flourishing from my perspective. So coming back to your question, Maddie, what does it mean to flourish? For me, flourishing consists of two things. The first is to be on an intentional journey to fully and completely love myself, to love all parts of myself, the good, the bad, the ugly. And that's not always easy. And the second is to intentionally work on fully and completely loving others and accepting others no matter who they are. And man, that is a tough one. And I fall short every day trying to do that, right? Because my mind will come up with so many reasons as to why I have a right to judge and condemn the other person. But over time, I've come to realize and learn the lesson that it's better to try and love other people that I don't agree with, than to expend my energy judging them. And that is exhausting, and it is life sucking, and it takes my peace of mind away. So for me, to intentionally work on loving others is more an act of self-preservation that enables me to flourish, and that's what we practically talk about, we teach when we do the work under the Education for Flourishing project. So yeah, that's kind of what it means for me personally, and then also professionally.
Well, I like that you've centered love, and we've got a chapter that's been years, very slow to come out, but it's been done for a couple of years now, and it's just very simply titled "Love as the Essence of Flourishing." And so what you're sharing is, resonates with me. So I think it's helpful to talk about the essence, and then maybe the fullness. So that's the kind of seed or the kernel, and then how does it get manifest across all of these other domains and dimensions. And so I also like the practical side of what you're sharing.
Yeah.
What about you, Matt?
For me, not as pretty definition. It's like, I don't know, bits and pieces. But
the core of it is like flourishing as a way of living, or is life for me. And I think love is at the center of that a lot as well, because okay, so how I was introduced to flourishing was in a very practical way. How I really dove into it was actually learning through the process for flourishing,
which is a tool to promote personal flourishing and build close social relationships. The steps for the process are presence and awareness, courage and vulnerability, gratitude and forgiveness, and balance and harmony.
And I think before I knew about the process, I viewed flourishing as just like synonymous with well-being, which I don't agree with now. I think well-being is within flourishing, but I think flourishing is a continuous thing. I think we may always be flourishing. Like you were saying, Matt, like there are different parts of your life where you may be flourishing more or less. Because I think a lot of that is recognizing the balance between what we determine as good and bad, because that's also subjective. So how I view something as good is not how someone else would view as good. And so like flourishing is a framework for me to understand that like it's a way for me to view life in a more open and present way, which requires love. So that's generally what I would say.
Well, that's great. And I wonder, because it sounds like you've had a shift in how you frame it.
Mm-hmm.
What was the cause of the shift? You know, if you're moving through a society, American society, up to a certain age, and then you encounter a different context or a different set of influence that causes you to reframe, what was the cause of that shift for you? Because I think that it goes back to the idea that we are embedded in different contexts. And so we can be in a context that's orienting us towards kind of, you know, the way to think about it is selfish well-being. Or we can be in a context that's inviting us to move in a way that's consistent with loving promotion of flourishing for others, not just, you know, for ourselves. So what was the turning point or the shift? Or maybe there wasn't one. Maybe it was a gradual awareness that you've had. But how did that move for you?
For me, that was actually, it was being able to view the process for flourishing as specific steps. For my generation, I think there was an increase, especially like when I was in high school, and talking about mental health, which is awesome. Like it's a great thing to focus on. But then it was never made practical. It was always like, in general, mental health is a good thing to focus on. And we know that it's bad, that people are struggling. But how do you actually personalize that? And so the shift for flourishing was focusing not only just as like, for me, it was actually focusing more on the individual rather than the like communal. Because I think I'd always heard of how this is a great thing for communal, and like, yes, we need other people, but shifting my focus on, I can't really do that unless I also care and apply the parts of flourishing to myself. Because I can't give what I can't talk about something I'm not doing myself.
Because when I first started the flourishing work, I was pretty skeptical of it. And I thought, like I said earlier, this would just be like generalized well-being work. But this shift in conversations with Amrita and using the 4-step process, which had just been introduced to me, made me really individualize it.
So like, for me, there was a turning point. It was probably like, 3 years ago at this point, where Amrita and I actually just like sat down and had conversations. And it was, how does this apply to me specifically rather than just in general? So I started with spirituality, like looking in the spiritual aspects of my life, because that was, still is, but especially was then like a struggle for me.
because I had grown up Christian and had steered away from it at this point. And I was pretty angry and frustrated with the Christianity and the religion I had grown up with. But because this was a part of my life that I recognized I struggled in, though, I needed to focus on it.
And I was just like, okay, I'll start with being aware of like the facts. How am I feeling about certain aspects of spirituality and whatnot? And then how can I like dive deep into that? So, and then an even stronger shift later on, probably like a year and a half ago, was the idea that I have to love myself to be able to love others. Because like growing up,
where did that come from, if you don't mind me asking? How did that shift happen?
That one was more gradual. I think that came from, again, the same idea with flourishing. Like, I can't talk about flourishing if I'm not actually actively working on it myself. And then the same thing of like, okay, obviously love comes up when you're talking about flourishing. And I can all the time be like, oh yes, love. The like golden rule comes up for me. It's like, love others as you love yourself. But you can't love others if you don't actually love yourself.
Because this golden rule was actually constantly mentioned growing up in my religious context, but I was never truly taught to apply the part of loving yourself, because I felt like it was a selfish thing. And I felt like I was taught that it was a selfish thing to have that self-love.
And that is probably what the shift was, is having conversations around that and me realizing like, oh, I can talk about loving other people all the time and like communal flourishing that comes from that, but it doesn't matter if I don't love myself. Because then like there's nothing there's things I can give, but it's not the same. It's not as deep.
Well, one thing I noticed about your context, which was different than mine when I was going through even undergraduate, but certainly high school and whatnot, is we did not have an emphasis on social and emotional learning or mental health. It just wasn't. It was absent.
Yeah.
You could go to the counselor if you had a breakdown, but there wasn't any conversation or any understanding of that in the kind of normal progression.
Yeah.
And I didn't have someone like Amrita. So one thing you noted is a conversation with Amrita. So there wasn't somebody like that who was talking about a different way to understand flourishing and to put self-love at the core of that. So that those things were absent from my context.
Yeah.
And so you discover it in various ways in other contexts, but that wasn't the mainstream. And so that might be something that is now, I think there is a lot of dissatisfaction with how far can you go with social and emotional learning without linking it to love and flourishing. And I think, you can know just how depressed or anxious you are, but maybe you can't know how well you might flourish if you're not being offered a framework to aspire towards and to prioritize, as you were saying, not just loving others, but loving yourself. I think that, the healthiest forms of love are mutual, and that's what we strive towards. But sometimes we encounter people in our lives who aren't ready to reciprocate. And so do we say, no, or do we say, as one of my friends puts it, in the giving of self lies the unsought discovery of a better self, at the right dose. You don't, completely give yourself away, but you give a little bit. You extend yourself in order to offer some grace to someone who's not ready to reciprocate, but not in a way that compromises your boundaries or puts you at risk or something. So, there's always, to me, the interesting thing, and this is why I started with Paul Wong, if you really love, you make yourself vulnerable. And that means you're willing to suffer. But, you can also, that can become unhealthy. We can become attached to our own suffering. So philosophers talk about adaptive preferences. We come to prefer the things that aren't in the interest of our actual true flourishing because we sort of get habituated to them. So this is, to me, why it is important, as I've had conversations with Amrita as well, it is important for people to help you see something that's destructive in your life that you might not see, like just the simple thing of, well, we're being told to be very altruistic and always help others, but if we don't love ourselves, then that can become very destructive. And so having those influences and dialogue partners is really helpful. And again, this is why I think the social and emotional learning culture doesn't always go far enough.
And then I think that also emphasizes, like, yes, because my conversations with Amrita allowed me to really dive deep into like my personal stuff, but then that wouldn't have been as possible, or maybe wouldn't have happened right then without the communal aspect.
And it's really between both the individual and the other person in these relationships and conversations, because the conversation was partially because of the other person, Amrita, in this case, but it was also able to occur because I had to be willing to have that conversation and be vulnerable.
So it's like, you're completely right. You have like the individual, but you also have the communal, because without Amrita, that would not have happened the same way for myself.
It's almost like coming back to that whole thing of balance, right? Like it's learning. It's always striving towards that balance, and we come to that state of balance only for momentarily, right? And then we get off balance. But each time we come back to that balance, it's easier to come back to that, and it may be a little bit longer than the last time, right? And then it's almost like that continuous journey. I want to go back to something that the two of you brought up in terms of love and sometimes when we do have these conversations, and if the person is coming to that conversation for the first time, it can be kind of confusing, and it may seem like it's a very selfish piece that we are talking about, that we are promoting love yourself, and that's a very selfish act. And the way I want to put it is, it's almost like it's a selfless selfishness, right?
You're reminding me, Amrita. Adam Grant, I think, talks about selfish people, other focused people, selfless. So there's selfish, there's selfless, where you're totally other focused, and then there's other-ish. I like that kind of idea, that you care about yourself, you care about others. Why not integrate? Why not balance that? Other-ish is maybe the way to think about it. Is that language describing what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's one way of looking at it. Yes, and within that, then we can then delve into those whole the different pieces around character and virtue, right? I mean, then how do we love is a whole different ballgame. Like, that's where like the practice of it comes in. Like, are we practicing love that is forgiving? Is it love that can be grateful for pretty much what comes our way, right? Like, for example, one step of the process is gratitude and forgiveness, and it was very intentional to put the two of those things together in the third step of the process, because as human beings, and I'll just give a personal example. Matt, you can do 99 good things for me, right? But you do one thing that I do not like. The only thing I will focus on is that one thing.
Yeah, that negativity bias that we have as a survival mechanism, really.
And that's one of the barriers to our flourishing that we talk about in our work. But that's where like the gratitude and forgiveness, and learning when to jump from forgiveness to gratitude and when to jump from gratitude to forgiveness. So I do need to forgive you for the one thing that you do that I really don't like and you really tick me off. But I, at the same time, have to remember the 99 good things you have done for me, right? And that helps me be more forgiving.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a matter of like breaking down, and that's why I want to come back to the practical flourishing, right? Let's concretely talk about steps that we can take to flourish. Because it's one thing for us in academia to talk about these things, which is great, and I love doing that, right? But then there's also the practical side, working with the younger generation or working with educators, right? We cannot have those academic conversations with them, right? We have to talk about the practicality of it all. And I think that's kind of where, Maddie, what you brought up, the process really comes in handy. You know, it comes in handy for myself, as in like I use it in my own life. I use it in my relationship with other people, and also in relationship with the community that I'm in.
Yeah.
You know, so yeah, I just wanted to kind of chime in with the things that you guys were saying.
Yeah, you know, and some people might say, well, I don't have time for that. That's an add-on. I've got a busy life, all this stuff. But one of the things I just got done doing an event last week at Harvard with Steve Gund, who has a company based in St. Louis, actually, so in your backyard, called the Gund Company, and they have, you know, subsidiaries around the world. But his point was, if you do this well, you attain a higher level of operational excellence. And that's language that really resonates with administrators across sectors who have to get things done. You know, we've got to achieve a certain goal or the resources will choke off and we won't be able to do anything. So we actually need operational excellence. And what in the process that you're describing, or you've partially described, I know, you know, Maddie alluded to it as well, it actually helps us attain operational excellence. Life gets easier. We become more productive if we get in touch with the reality of the deep life, which is what the process is really aiming at, and stop fooling ourselves with adaptive preferences that are maybe not in the service of our growth and are not energizing. So if we can get over that kind of mental barrier of, oh no, I don't, how can I do this? I've got, you know, full days. I've got so many responsibilities. I can't think about another thing. You know, my response is, if you do this, you attain a higher level of what Steve refers to as operational excellence. And he says, you know, we shifted the culture of our company from customer first to our people first. And then our people take care of the customer. So if we're not helping people who are on our team to flourish, then it doesn't matter what kind of lip service we give to customer first, because people are going to be disengaged or rowing in the opposite direction or whatever. Yeah. So let's get this right. Let's lead with flourishing and understand how that's going to have ripple effects into operational excellence. And then the customer is going to be better served. Yeah. He's in the business of electrical widgets, he would call them, you know. He's like, it's not super inspiring stuff, but it is inspiring how we do it. It is inspiring how we relate to each other, how we serve the customer, and how we grow the business so people can have more opportunities. That is inspiring, even if it's just widgets.
Matt, you're reminding me of what my friend Ted says. And I was saying this to Maddie earlier, life gets in the way of flourishing. That's kind of what you were talking about, right? That's and life will always get in the way of flourishing if we let it. But the whole point is that exactly is flourishing. What do we do when life gets in the way of us flourishing? That's kind of the practice of it.
As they say in Eastern traditions, the obstacle becomes the path.
There you go.
You don't try to avoid the obstacle, but you lean into the obstacle and you say, oh, this is an opportunity. What does it mean to actually flourish, instead of trying to escape from life and call that flourishing? So we've been talking a bit. Maddie, what are your thoughts about these kinds of themes that we're bringing up?
No, I completely agree. That just makes me think of, like, flourishing is a way of examining our lives as well. It's like with all this knowledge about flourishing and whatnot, it helps us really examine like how are we living our lives daily. Like it's not necessarily, sure, you're adding on that extra thinking, but you're, as you were saying earlier, like it's gonna be better in the long run. And it's also, for me at least, I'm like, why would I not want to be more aware of how I'm living my life every day? Because being more open and aware is going to better me in every possible way. So, yeah.
I think that's really important, starting with awareness. What are we able to notice about ourselves and about our contexts, people we relate with?
Mm-hmm.
And, and getting a higher level of understanding of that is going to have all kinds of benefits down the road. And if we stay in the dark, so to speak, we'll have all kinds of conflicts and calamities down the road. And that's really going to be inefficient. So I think that's right to start with awareness and then really get clear about the intention or the purpose. Now that I have this awareness, what is it that I actually want to do? Not what have I been conditioned to think I want to do, but what is it that I actually want to do? And how do I want to do it? And who would be my collaborators in doing these things? So you start to cut away you extract the signal from the noise. There's a lot of noise. Where's the signal that is really?
And you're playing into the process right there, Matt. The 4-step process, and Maddie, if you want to share that might.
The 4 steps. So it goes first, presence and awareness. 2, courage and vulnerability. 3, gratitude and forgiveness. And then 4, balance and harmony. I use this as a way to like approach most things in my life. Like anytime I'm like really thinking about something, I'm like, okay, let me, like maybe there's a problem in my life or a conflict. And so I'll first focus on just like being present in the moment when that conflict is happening. And then reflection after it, which for me is like awareness. Okay, let me think through what actually happened. What was I aware of at the moment? What am I aware of now after the fact? And then exactly what you were saying, like the second step, you have to have action. And so courage and vulnerability on the process is like considering, do you need to be vulnerable in these circumstances? A lot of times we do, because anytime emotion is involved, we need vulnerability. And vulnerability takes courage. And also you need courage to do that action. And then gratitude and forgiveness comes after that, because it's considering, okay, what am I grateful for in this situation? That's going to allow me to actually like really push into that courage and vulnerability. What have I maybe done wrong? Forgiveness for myself, forgiveness for the other person or situation. And then like it ends with balance and harmony, because it's what are there's always 2 sides or multiple to a story. So like, how can we balance that? And then also, how can we consider this like lesson for the whole context of our lives? How can I move forward and continuously make these changes? And then it's just like a loop. So it keeps going. That's how I use the process.
So why was that appealing to you? Because a lot of people can be exposed to that opportunity and say, no, that's, an add-on, or that's too much. Like, why did it resonate, or how did it creep into your life in a way that you could engage with it, or that you were motivated to engage with it?
For me, it was having just a step-by-step framework. Like literally, like this is what you can start with. Try it out. Because I had never really had another framework before that like was actually start with this and then go and try it. So, and then that was like coupled with conversations with Amrita and other people in my life, like really diving deep into each part of it and thinking through each step. And that's really what struck with me, is like literally there was just a first step that I could try.
Mm-hmm. Well, but you must have felt safe enough with Rita to try it.
Yeah.
So there's some relational, when we think about flourishing being partly about the conditions of the soil, there was some fertile ground in which that process, if it's the seed, could take root.
Can I jump in on that piece? Because I remember those conversations, Maddie, and I don't know if it was always comfortable for you, right? Like I remember like
Yeah.
there were conversations where I was just asking you questions, which I at least my understanding was were making you uncomfortable
Yeah.
in some ways, right? Because those were questions that were not, I guess, asked before.
No, I don't mean it can't be uncomfortable. I mean that she has to trust you to answer and to be uncomfortable and to be vulnerable. That's the invitation.
But here's the thing, Matt, though. How can people have trust when they first meet each other? Because Maddie and I didn't really know each other. There was no reason for her to trust me or for me to trust her. It was we both were coming into that situation, right? Like just as people, because we didn't have a prior relationship that was built on trust. Like the trust was built as we did the work together, right? So it's a very interesting thing, right? That we talk about.
Maddie, how did you experience that? So it wasn't the first time you met, was it? Maybe it was
No.
some set of meetings, and then that comes up down the road. But how did you experience it? Like, did you feel like, oh, this is someone who A, cares about me, and B, will not destroy me if I share something difficult or share something personal? I mean, that's what I mean by, kind of psychological trust. Did you have that established, or did you just go for it independent of knowing how it would land?
I think it's a bit of both, because I already struggle opening up to people if I don't like have a basis of trust, or like if I have a reasoning in my mind for why I may trust them. And so like, sure, it was pretty early on that we had these conversations one-on-one, but I had Amrita as a professor for like a whole semester before that. So like I did know Amrita, but we hadn't had these conversations. So there was that trust built because we already knew each other, not well, but like we knew of each other. And I think a lot of it though is just like you have to make the active choice to commit to these conversations and being fully honest and vulnerable, because that could happen with anyone that you're like, technically you could just pick up this conversation with a stranger and actively commit to just sharing these vulnerable sides. It's less likely because we don't trust them, but that's exactly what you're saying. Like a lot of it is that relationship, because most people, me included, would not feel comfortable enough to have these conversations with someone we haven't already known for at least a little bit.
Well, and the other side is what you were bringing to it, because Amrita could teach 100 students over multiple semesters, and not everybody's going to step forward the way that you did. So there's also, there's an invitation, and it has to be accepted and acted on. So, it might be that you were motivated to want to lean into it. I'm asking the question. I don't know.
Yeah.
You were motivated to lean into the invitation because maybe you saw something possible with Amrita that you hadn't seen in some of your other classes or whatever. I don't know, because in my own experience, sometimes I would perceive in a professor, oh, there's something that they understand that seems a little bit different than what the others are at least projecting, or the presence that they're offering. And so I would seek some of those professors out and try to understand more about, how I could perhaps grow as a person if I paid attention to something that they were offering, if I took the initiative. So is that a fair characterization of your own experience?
Yeah. So I think part of it was actually Amrita approached me too, which is funny. Like,
so that's the invitation.
Yeah. So that was the invitation, and then I accepted, and I was like, okay, let's keep talking.
Okay.
So
It was just easier because at that point in time I had some funding for a project I was working on. So I asked Maddie if she wanted to work on the Flourishing project.
And I said yes.
And why Maddie as opposed to 100 other students?
I do not know, and no, I'll take that back. I think that was the intuitive side of me, and I don't know how to rationally explain that because each student in that class was equally capable, right? And like no one was less than Maddie or more than Maddie, right? They were all in the same space. And it's just one of those things. I just reached out to her and she said yes. And then that's when it was like, if you're going to do the flourishing work, then you got to flourish yourself first. And I think that was one of the first conversations we had, if I remember, or maybe the second or third conversation, but that was one of the things that I remember saying to her at some point. You got to flourish if you're going to do this work.
Well, I think the intuition is really important and not always encouraged in academic spaces. It's all kind of cognitive, intellectual, and not so much about intuitions or feelings. But there's information in our world that our intuitive side can pick up that our cognitive side is just blind to. And so it's interesting that we don't develop that intentionally for the most part. I mean, maybe St. Louis University is different, but most of the universities I've been part of, it's a heavy emphasis on the left brain kind of way of processing and not the right brain. Is, if you look at some of like Ian McGilchrist's work, as they understand the different complementary ways that the different parts of the brain process reality and then try to integrate that. We tend to let one side atrophy and overemphasize the other side. And that creates a lot of institutions, and this is really his thesis, that then we create institutions that devalue the intuitive. And then we're essentially operating with half a brain, and we get results that are consistent with an awareness that's underdeveloped. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of metrics that are very reductionistic and ultimately harmful, but easy to act upon from a kind of hypercognitive way of being. So I think that what you're both modeling is what happens when we lean into the intuitive.
I want to just quickly say two things to that. One, definitely being at a Jesuit institution, which St. Louis University is, it definitely, to do the flourishing work, I mean, it couldn't have been a better fit. It just perfectly fits in there, right? And then also this whole piece about the intuitive side of things. And I think it's more in the realm of spirituality, I would think and say, right? And that is something that we don't talk about often when it comes to flourishing. So I'm glad that you brought that topic up, and that is something that we'll be talking about in our subsequent podcast sessions. So I'm glad that you're bringing that piece up.
Now that we've been talking about the process a bit, Matt, I want to know what are the practical things you do to flourish in your daily life?
It's a really good question because I've been recently trying to aim for quality over quantity.
Yeah.
There's a lot of productivity, a lot of abundance, a lot of possibilities, and I feel like over the last few years, with an accountability partner like Amrita, constantly reminding me to walk the talk when I forget, that I have been able to experience a higher quality of creative work, I guess is how I would say it, and that creative work includes collaborations, certainly, and also just some time for contemplation, which I had not prioritized. In previous years, I travel a lot, and I would say, okay, good. In the back of a taxi, I can answer a few emails. And then at the airport, I can quickly draft an essay. And then on the plane, I can work on this book or something like that. And I found it, ultimately rather exhausting. And then realized that a lot of what I was doing was pretty scattered. And so lately, I've been focusing more on the essentials. And, what that means, I was just thinking about a talk that I want to give in a couple weeks. And I wasn't sure about the title, and I was half joking when I suggested this to the organizers, but they liked it, so I think we'll go with it. But the title is The Lure of the Impossible, Promoting Flourishing for All as a Work of Unlimited Love. So, I acknowledge that that's impossible, and yet, as we lean into the work with love, it's impossible for us as individuals, but it becomes possible when we collaborate with great clarity of purpose. And so, my other accountability partner, Jim Ritchie Dunham, is the founder of the Institute for Strategic Clarity. And the point is that we waste a lot of time running in circles.
Yeah.
And we've got all this pseudo productivity, but these outputs are not deeply connected to a noble purpose. And so they're just outputs, and they count in some sense towards your citation index or something like that. But so what? And so, one of the things that I've disciplined myself to make more time for is to just sit on the airplane and say, I've got a 4-hour flight. I don't need to be productive in, a conventional sense of being able to say, I got a chapter finished or I started some new project or something. But really to ask the question and take the time to really lean into it, what is the purpose? And how is my purpose misaligned with the purposes of my collaborators? And if so, where are we going? If that is the case. So really to spend some time, not in conventional productivity mode, but in this contemplative mode of, all right, well, there's been enough of that. Now, that's a work of love because, ultimately, and the definition of love is tricky, but at its basic level, it's just wanting, either if it's self-love, wanting myself to flourish, or if it's love for others, wanting others to flourish. How do we flourish together? So that's really simple, like oversimplified, but at its root, that's what it is. So if I actually want to flourish, I can spend a little bit more time paying attention to what I'm doing and asking the question, is this actually in service of the purpose? Or is this just something that's externally rewarded or requested by others or whatever? So
And Matt, right there, you brought in the process again, the presence and awareness. Like it starts. It's like the presence and awareness is the foundational step for that. Like we cannot flourish without being present and aware.
But if you're super busy and being driven by grant deadline, I've got a grant deadline this week. That's why I mentioned that. Final report I'm trying to get done, get off my desk so other people can have a look at it. But if that's out of balance.
And that's what I was going to say. That's where it's we have to look at it from a balanced perspective as well. And that balance can be either in a week's time or a month's time or over the long haul. but at some point that balance, things need to balance itself out, and
How do you both strike a balance in our busy world?
Let me just quickly answer this, Matt, and I'll hand it over to you. For me, it's the focus and awareness of what is important. And that's what I'm going to put my energy and time on more than what is less important, but maybe needs to get done, right? So it's the prioritizing of things I need to get done, and so it's the balance that comes from being present and aware, and then also the courage and vulnerability to say, you know what, do I really need to do this? Is it really important, or is it something I'm doing because I want to be polite and play the game, right? Like, and do I have the courage to say, no, I'm not going to do this, right? So it's like, it's a matter of like recognizing, it's playing off of each of those steps, right? Yeah.
I also think when someone's super busy, it's finding the things that we do in our daily life that we can bring in more contemplation. So like when you're showering, you have like a 15-minute block pretty much that you can just think, because you're not doing anything that requires a lot of mental thinking, or like on your commute in the morning or something. So it's like also finding the times when it's like when you are really busy and you can't say, like sometimes we can't say no to things, and like the no is a really powerful thing. I think making sure we have rest is obviously very important, but when you are really busy, it's finding those times where it's like, okay, when can I be more intentional to really like be aware of what I'm doing right now and contemplate the goings on in your life. So
I find that I would say I waste less time on pseudo productivity, and that opens up more time to be more aware.
yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
And that means, not having maybe as many publications or whatever as I might have on an annual basis in the past. But ideally, the things that I'm producing, I look back and I say, oh, I really am glad that I could share that.
Yeah, like the quality or quantity that you were saying.
And that's an act of courage, from what little I know of you, Matt, to say no as well, right? Like, yeah, you don't need another publication.
Yeah, a friend once told me no is a complete sentence.
Yeah.
I would try to justify why. It's like, no, it's just no. You're not doing it. It's not bad. It's just okay to say no. You're not doing it.
Thank you again for listening to our podcast episode. Thank you to both Amrita and Matt for hosting with me, and thank you to everyone involved in the Education for Flourishing work. We will continue having these conversations for you to listen in on. Tune in to our next episode, where we will explore how we flourish in contexts that are not always safe and supportive. Thank you.